According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in 2015, 59% of young people in juvenile detention are Indigenous. Amanda Porter, researcher at the Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology, Sydney, opines that the removal of Indigenous children and subsequent placement into detention centres is comparable to the agony, mistreatment, and injustices suffered by the stolen generations in the 20th century. With Indigenous overrepresentation in prisons steadily rising and a history of racism, neglect, and prejudice pervading the Indigenous community, Porter states that imprisonment rates in Australia have now moved far beyond a criminal justice issue. Rather, it has become a social issue that must be addressed by all Australians. Indeed, politicians and policymakers must take notice and work on rectifying this issue. However, everyday citizens like you and I can also make a meaningful difference. We believe difference can be achieved in three ways. Number one, by accessing and informing ourselves with meaningful and accurate information about youth and Indigenous imprisonment issues. Two, engaging in meaningful, rational, and critical public deliberation with the aim of cultivating a mutual understanding about youth Indigenous imprisonment issues. And number three, spreading the word and facilitating avenues for others to access accurate and insightful information about youth Indigenous imprisonment, enabling them to engage and participate in the public debate surrounding these issues.
In this podcast, we'll be highlighting several useful interventions, strategies, and programs that we believe can step up the mistreatment and torture of youth in juvenile detention and also curtail the increasing rate of Indigenous youth imprisonment. Moreover, we hope to equip you with the knowledge and avenues to make a meaningful change to stop the mistreatment and overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in juvenile detention. All research we draw upon will be recorded in the description, as well as podcasts on our Facebook page ATS2440 Prisons. Mandatory sentencing was a topic covered in a video posted on our ATS2440 Prisons Facebook and YouTube pages. A link to this video will be provided in the description section of this podcast. To recap, Hale Tubers of the University of Western Australia opines that mandatory sentencing involves legislative interventions by the government that set a minimum mandatory sentence of certain offences. Consequently, they could tell a judge discretionary power to take into account a case of particular circumstances that could reduce the sentence. Mandatory sentencing aims to reduce crime in two ways: by removing the opportunity for criminals to offend by locking them up, and deters them through threats of jail time and serious penalties.
A 2014 edition of Fact Check, published by the ABC, details the introduction of mandatory sentencing in Australia. The Northern Territory first implemented mandatory sentencing laws in 1997 to curtail property crime. Under the laws, first-time offenders of a property crime were imprisoned for a fortnight, 90 days for a second strike, and a year for a third property crime offence. Western Australia also implemented a three-strike imprisonment regime in 1996 for home burglary convictions. Experts find it difficult to correlate mandatory sentencing with a decrease in crimes. While some studies suggest crime has fallen under these type measures, the Victorian Sentencing Advisory finds no clear link between sanction severity and levels of offending. From a more critical outlook, Dean of Bond University's Law Faculty, Geraldine McKenzie, states that little evidence has been found that substantiates mandatory sentencing as a viable method of deterring potential offenders for violent crimes, especially those involving drugs and alcohol. Evidently, mandatory sentencing has done little to curb rates of Indigenous imprisonment, with 27% of Australia's prison population consisting of Indigenous prisoners. A glaring statistic, considering they account for only 2.5% of the total Australian population. Furthermore, on average, it costs approximately $440,000 a year for each young person in detention. There are, however, suggestions of a more equitable and effective solution rather than mandatory sentencing. Justice reinvestment is a data-driven and more cost-effective approach that focuses on building alternative pathways for potential offenders and stronger communities by diverting money that would normally be spent on prisons into community services and support. Justice reinvestment aims to intervene and prevent crime before it happens by ensuring the community is actively involved in the ownership of their issues, but also in the ownership of potential solutions and initiatives that may prevent these crimes. Tom Calmer, Chancellor of the University of Canberra, points to justice reinvestment's success in the United States of America, with implementation of reinvestment programs at state and county level said to have reduced offences and saved taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. The justice reinvestment approach is now being trialled in 2 towns in New South Wales, according to Smart Justice Australia. The Ramanguka Justice Reinvestment Pilot Project in the small New South Wales town of Burke has shown much promise and is a partnership between Just Reinvest New South Wales, the Burke Aboriginal Community Working Party, and the Australian Human Rights Commission, with a collective impact approach to ensure new and stronger relationships across the different sectors to ensure lasting social change, as well as a strong focus on data-driven decision-making and empowerment of the community and new stakeholders. The Burke program has made some promising interventions. Early years education is a major focus, with an early years transition centre opening in Burke 3 years ago to enable young children, mostly aged 4, to get used to learning environments. Free driving lessons have also led to the lowest number of driving offences in Burke in 10 years. Finally, a focus on ending domestic violence has shown positive signs, while directly addressing the problem of the rapidly growing contingent of Indigenous women in prisons, many of whom have been affected by domestic violence. In Burke, police are now required to undertake follow-up visits to perpetrators and domestic violence victims under the new Justice Reinvestment Program. Since this initiative began 3 months ago, not a single case of domestic violence reoffending has occurred.
Mentoring program and culture centers has also made important contribution to breaking the system circle of young Indigenous imprisonment. The Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience focus on mentoring students throughout high school and into university by building their skill, opportunities, belief, and confidence to go and succeed. In 2014, AIME student has arranged year 12 attainment of 93.2%, a huge success. The National Centre of Indigenous Excellence also provide a holistic range of programs encompassing learning about arts, culture, healthy, sports, and innovation.
While it is still in the early stages of development, justice reinvestment programs have already shown to have highly positive and effective outcomes. Further challenges are bound to manifest themselves. However, instead of investing in prisons and perpetuating the cycle of Indigenous and young Indigenous imprisonment, we believe steps can be taken to intervene and prevent crime before it even happens.